just watch. I hope it makes you think about bees a different way. Because if you see a bee, you don't just want to squash it because it helps you have food to eat, doesn't it? All those tasty vegetables and fruits that we saw in that video, bees have a big hand in helping them grow. And so we don't want to just squish bees. They're important to our ecosystem, our environment, and our food. So what we're going to look at today is we're talking about plants. We're going to kind of take it up a notch. We've been talking about plant parts and how plants produce food. Today's lesson is how do plants reproduce? And that word reproduce is, we could say, how do plants make more plants? Okay. So just like animals have babies, plants have to have little plants growing too, or we won't have any more plants, will we? So we know that part of it's going to be a seed. We put seeds in the ground to make new plants grow, but there's more to it than that. So today's lesson gets into the science of how seeds are made and how plants make more plants. We've seen a little bit about it. So we've talked about bees carrying pollen and things like that. But today gets into some real details about it. And so as we go through the lesson today, you're going to hear a couple of words that you might make you want to giggle, but just be mature about it, okay? It's important things that you need to know about plants. So here we go. How do plants reproduce? And we are on page 215 in your science book. I meant to tell you, you need to follow along with me. So make sure that you have your science book. If you need to pause the video, go get it and come back. Okay. All right. So 215, this is kind of a long lesson. So you're going to want to pay attention and follow along with me. When a plant grows, it goes through a series of set stages. The series of stages that living thing goes through as it develops is called a life cycle. It is important for people to understand plant life cycles because most of the food we eat comes from plants. Most plants grow from seeds. First, a seed is placed in the soil so it can sprout. Next, the plant grows until it reaches maturity. A mature plant may grow flowers or cones. Then these structures make more seeds. You'll learn about flowers and cones on the next page. So let's look down here at the bottom, a lima bean life cycle. Have you ever planted lima beans? I've not planted lima beans. I've planted a lot of different kinds of green beans. I guess that's a kind of green bean too, but not the kind of bean that's my favorite. I like the peanut beans and what else do I plant? Other kind of beans in my garden. Well, let's take a look at this life cycle though. Where does it start? It starts with these seeds, doesn't it? So that would be number one if we were putting these in order. Then we'd have to plant the seed. And then number two, that little seedling would start to grow. A little sprout would come up from the ground. And then it would grow bigger, and on it would start forming these little flowers. And then the beans would start growing from the flowers. That's just how it happens with green beans in my garden when they grow. So flowers and cones. There are about 310,000 types of plants. Almost 90% of them produce seeds. How do plants produce seeds? Flowers and cones are reproductive structures that make seeds. They produce sex cells. Sex cells are used during sexual reproduction. Male sex cells are called sperm and female sex cells are called eggs. Fertilization, here's a vocabulary word you need to know, is the process of a sperm cell and an egg cell joining together. A fertilized egg grows into an embryo inside a seed. About 1,000 types of plants produce seeds in cones. In plants with cones, sperm are made in the male cones and eggs are made in the female cones. Male plants produce seeds in structures called flowers. In plants with flowers, grains of pollen produced in parts called anthers contain the sperm. Eggs are made in a structure called a pistil. Not the type that you shoot a gun with, a different kind of pistil, it's spelled differently. Many flowers have both anthers and a pistil. As you can see in the picture, flowers have many other parts as well. So let's take a look at a flower here. The male organ is the stamen. All right, it's this part right here. It consists of a thin stalk topped by a sac-like anther, which produces pollen. So these are the little things sticking up. Have you ever seen a honeysuckle flower? Have you ever taken a honeysuckle off the fence vine and pulled the end off and then licked the pollen off the inside, the nectar on the inside? I used to do that all the time. But these little things that stick up that have the pollen on the top there, those are called stamen. So they're very thin. If you try to see the difference, they're thin and they have that pollen there on the top, okay? Of course, we know what the petals are on a flower, but this bigger part in the center of a flower kind of looks like a vase or something. It's the female organ. It's called the pistil. It's a rounded base that contains the eggs inside it. Okay, let's move on. I always start sneezing when I record these lessons. And then, so if you don't have a flower, then you've got these pine cones or cones. A female pine cone makes egg cells. A male pine cone makes sperm cells. Most cone-bearing plants are trees. Pines, spruces, and cycads are all cone-bearing plants. So if we're labeling the plant parts here, okay, what are we going to label them? Do you remember? All right, so we've got all these different lines here. This would be the what? That stem going up. I can't tell what it's pointing to. This looks like the part in the middle. This looks like the bulb. The vase-like part that's sticking up. So what is that? That's the pistil. And then you've got these little things, thin things sticking up with the pollen that would be on them. Those are the stamen. Then this would be the petal. The power of pollen. In order for plant eggs to be fertilized, pollen has to move from the male parts to the female parts. How does the pollen get there? Plants reproduce through pollination. Pollination is the process of pollen moving from the male plant part to a female plant part. There are several ways this can happen. Sometimes wind can blow pollen from one plant to another, which is how many grasses and trees are pollinated. Other plants are pollinated by pollinators, like bees, birds, butterflies, and other animals are pollinators. Birds? What do you mean? Can you think of a bird that lands on flowers? And how about a hummingbird? Hummingbirds like flowers, don't they? For example, a butterfly goes from flower to flower drinking nectar. At each flower, the pollen on the stamen rubs off on the butterfly. When the butterfly visits the next flower, the pollen may drop off and fall on the pistil. As a result, the flower will be pollinated. So let's go back to this picture here. So as a butterfly, a bee or something comes to this flower, there's pollen on the stamen, and that pollen sticks to the butterfly or the bee. And then when he goes to the next flower, part of it, he rubs right here on the pistil, and it goes down inside it, and it starts forming seeds down inside there from the eggs. Okay? And flowers are brightly colored, and they smell good to make those insects want to come to them so that they can get the pollen on those insects and make more plants. Some water plants are pollinated by water. Flowing water carries pollen from plant to plant, so that water gets the pollen in it and it carries it to another plant. Wind blows pollen from male cones. The wind may carry the pollen to a female cone. Have you ever, in the spring, especially on a windy day, been by a tree and the wind blew really hard and you could just almost see a yellow cloud of pollen blow from the tree? Yeah, that'll make you sneeze for sure. That's a pollen cloud. It's the wind can blow that pollen and land it on another part of a plant, a female part, and make it start making seeds again. The other types of cones. Here's another math problem here. Animals pollinate 3/4 of seed-making plant. Animals would include those insects also. Wind and water pollinate the other 1/4 of plants. So if we were going to label this, the bigger part, 3/4 of it, we'd label it animals pollinating plants. 1/4, this smaller part, would be wind and water pollinating it. So plants are pollinated a lot more by animals than by wind and water. Seeds on the move. Unlike most animals, plants cannot move around in their environment. So how can a plant's seeds spread from place to place? Animals play a big role in moving plant seeds. The base of the pistil of flowers grows into a fruit that contains the flower seeds. Think of the seeds in an apple or a blackberry. When an animal eats these fruits, the seeds pass through the animal's body before being deposited elsewhere. Now let's think of a nice way we can say that, okay? So the seeds pass through the animal's body before being deposited elsewhere. So what does that mean? It means the animal eats the seeds and then it goes to the bathroom, okay? There's a nice way to say it. You want the bad way to say it. It poops, okay? It poops out the seeds on the ground, and then those seeds get in the dirt, and they start growing elsewhere, somewhere else, wherever the animal went to the bathroom at. So that's one way that animals can move seeds. Other animals will find and bury seeds. You've seen squirrels burying seeds in the ground, other animals. Think of squirrels. Squirrels bury acorns so they will have food in the winter. The squirrels will dig up and eat most of the acorns, but they may forget a few. These acorns will grow into new oak trees. Seeds such as burrs can also travel on an animal's body. Other kinds of seeds are very light. They can be carried by the wind. Still other seeds, including coconuts, can float in the water. So you've seen one of these dandelions when they've got the little seeds on them and you pick it up and blow it. You're spreading the seeds then. You're blowing it and making those seeds fly off into the air. They'll spread, land on the ground, and start growing somewhere else. These burrs that was talking about. Your dog ever been running through a field and come back with little things stuck on it everywhere? You probably got into some burrs. Some seeds are covered in little hooks. That's what I was talking about. These seeds are called burrs. They can easily attach to fur or even your socks. Many animals eat fruit. This helps spread the seeds contained in the fruit. We talked about that. The old birdie eats that seed, then he goes to the bathroom somewhere, and that seed is deposited somewhere else. How are each of these seeds most likely spread from place to place? Well, strawberry seeds, that's probably an animal like you and me, right? We may not spread it, but an animal, when I grow strawberries, like little rabbits or little birds like to come and eat the strawberries off the vine. Turtles sometimes do. And then they'll go to the bathroom and deposit those seeds. Okay, these look like they have little hooks on them, like those burrs. They'll stick to something and be carried away. Oh, yeah, those little, we called them helicopters when I was growing up, that fall from maple trees. Yeah, they fall in the wind, and the wind, they spin around. The wind blows them, so wind moves those. Other ways plants grow. Pine trees, beans, and sunflowers all grow from seeds. Other plants do not grow from seeds. These plants grow from structures called spores. So this is a fern. We like to put ferns on our back porch. We have a screened-in porch, and they grow little seeds on the leaves underneath the bottom of the leaves. They grow seeds like that, and those seeds are called spores. Spores are very tiny, and they can be carried long distances by the wind. Let's read about this. Have you ever looked at the underside of a fern leaf? You may have seen black or brown spots like the ones in the picture. These spots are made up of pockets filled with spores. A spore is a cell that can grow into a new plant when the conditions are right. Some plants, such as mosses and ferns, grow from spores instead of seeds. Plants that grow from spores have two distinct forms in their life cycle. Spores are released when the structures that hold them break open. Wind carries the spores to new places. And if a spore lands in a good spot, it will grow into a plant. So not that different from seed. They're just a lot smaller than seeds. So let's see how this works. A fern leaf or a frond is one form of the plant. The spore clusters grow on the underside of the fronds. When the clusters burst, spores are carried by the wind. So these little underneath there, they might burst open, and those little spores carried by the wind. And then if a spore lands in a good place, a place with good light and water, it begins to grow into a tiny, flat, heart-shaped structure like this. The heart-shaped structure is the other form of the plant. It produces eggs and sperm. If a sperm cell fertilizes an egg cell, a curled frond will begin to develop like this and push up out of the ground. And then that new plant reaches maturity where it can all happen over again. So I told you about our ferns that we like to keep on our back porch at my house, the screened-in porch. When they start in the winter, when it starts getting too cold for them, I like to put them underneath our deck. And underneath the deck now, where those spores have fallen off and into the ground, Now we have lots of fern plants growing by themselves underneath our deck, which I like. All right, so let's sum it up here. So we're going to match each statement with a correct image. When a seed germinates, the embryo in the seed grows. So I think that's going to be D here. We see a little embryo growing out of the seed, germinating seed. Have you ever planted one seed where you could see it growing? Or maybe got a bean seed and put it on a wet napkin inside a Ziploc bag, and you'll see that little seed start to germinate, and this embryo inside it starts growing into a plant. Okay, number 2, the female organ of the flower is the pistil, and the male organ of the flower is the stamen. I think that probably matches that. The pistil is the longer part there, and the stamen are the little parts with pollen on them. In order to make new seeds, flowers or cones need to be pollinated by animals, wind, or water. Well, I think that's probably E, don't you? The bee, he's pollinating the flower. He's getting that pollen on him and carrying it to another flower. Seeds can travel by water or wind or an animal's body or inside an animal's body. Well, I think that's A. That little squirrel, he's a cute little squirrel, isn't he? He's carrying an acorn. And then spores are stored in clusters on the underside of fern leaves. That's a fern leaf right there. Okay. Well, we've got a lot of new vocabulary words we learned today. Cone, cycle, fertilization, flower, germination, maturity, pollen, pollination, seed, and spore. Lots of vocabulary words. I want you today on your own to practice these. You're not going to have an assignment to do online. So I want you in your science book on page 225. I want you to do this crossword puzzle. Make sure you do it right, because you know what happens on our next lesson. You're going to have to use these words to get a grade in a vocabulary assignment. So do it right here, and then use this on your assignment in our next lesson, and you'll have the answers already. Easy peasy. All right, if we were to draw the life cycle of a flowering plant, what would we draw? We could draw a seed with a little plant growing out of it for germination. Growth, we could draw a little plant starting to grow. And pollination, maybe a bee on a flower that's on that plant. Circle the structures that the plants use to reproduce. Okay, does it use a flower? Sure, the flower is a big part of reproduction because that's where the pistil and the stamen are. A leaf, not so much for reproduction. Roots, nope. Thorns, nope. Cones, yes, they produce seeds too. 3 ways that a seed-forming plant can be pollinated. Okay, well, 1, a bee or butterfly can take pollen from the stamen and move it to the pistil. How else? Water, we said water can carry some of the pollen to another plant, and wind can blow some of the pollen to another plant. Look at the seed shown here. How do you think the seed is spread? Well, it looks like the top of a dandelion, doesn't it? We blow on those, so I think the wind would probably do that. Draw a picture of a flower and label its parts. Well, if we were to draw one, you can do it in your book. You'd have to have the petals, wouldn't you? And a stem, and maybe a long part of the middle that kind of looks like a vase. That would be the pistil. And then the little thin thing sticking out with the pollen on top, that would be the stamen. Explain how pollination is different from fertilization in flowers. Explain how pollination is different from fertilization in flowers. Hint, which needs to happen first, pollinization or fertilization? Okay, pollination is moving that pollen from one flower to another. Okay, so that moving the pollen from one flower to another, like bees, moving them, that's pollination. Fertilization is when that pollen gets from the stamen of one flower to the pistil of another and goes down inside, and it starts forming seeds down inside the pistil, and that's called fertilization. So pollination is moving the pollen. Fertilization is when that pollen gets inside the pistil and starts forming seeds. Okay, circle the pollinators below. Yep, definitely a bee could pollinate. Definitely a hummingbird could pollinate. He's got his little beak in the flowers there. A butterfly does. Fish, not so much. Crocodile or alligator, not so much either. All right, and that completes our lesson today on how plants reproduce. And so I hope you learned a lot about plant reproduction, fertilization, pollination. Remember to go back right now, complete this vocabulary page in your book. Kind of easy because it helps you know how many letters are in the words. That way it'll help you find the answers easier. But make sure you do this because that's a lot of words to know. We're going to practice them again in our next lesson. See you later.